The difference between good design and great design is often just inside the details. You might think you have to make some revolutionary changes to really improve the way your design looks, but I've found it's usually the subtle tweaks that make the biggest difference. In this video, I'm going to show you 5 different rules I follow myself when it comes to doing designs. Each of these tweaks are really easy to implement, and I think you can see instant results if you try to apply these to the projects you're working on. So whether you're a seasoned designer or a beginner just looking to get some quick wins, I think you're going to find something inside this video. If that sounds interesting to you, then stick around and let's get started. Now, button padding might sound like a funny place to start, but the padding you use on your button can make a big impact on the overall look and feel of your design. Not only that, but buttons are going to be used across your entire website, so any mistake you make here is going to get repeated 100 times over across the entire design. As designers, we tend to want to put an even amount of padding around everything to keep things nice and consistent. But that line of thinking doesn't really work when we talk about buttons. In fact, an even amount of padding around your entire button can make it look kind of short and stubby. Not only that, it almost feels as if you just barely touched it, it might fall over because it's so top heavy. And if you try to put a large border radius on it, then forget about it. The whole thing looks out of balance. One effective approach to solving this challenge is to use twice as much padding on the left and right, or the inline axis, as you do on the top and bottom, or the block axis. For example, if you had a button that had 15 pixels of padding top and bottom, then you would add 30 pixels left and right as kind of a starting place. This subtle change can actually make a pretty big difference. If you look at these two buttons side by side, you can definitely see that the one on the right looks a lot more stable than the one on the left. Now, while we're talking about it, I really prefer to use ems as my unit of measurement for my padding on buttons rather than pixels or rims or any other value. The reason being, ems are relative to the font size of the element. This means I can create a variety of buttons, including a large button or a small button, just by changing the font size of the button, and then the padding will scale proportionately. If you use a fixed value like a pixel, a big button's going to look like it has less padding, and a small button's going to look like it has more padding. But by using ems, which are relative to that font size, the padding's going to look consistent no matter what size button you create. The kind of uppercase text you'll use as things like pre-headings or eyebrows, sometimes even as like the category or little pills on side of badges inside your blog cards, can look really nice and really add to a design by varying up the different kinds of text on your site. But if you're not careful, making your text uppercase can actually make it a whole lot harder to read. To improve legibility, I like to add some extra letter spacing to any small uppercase text. I'll use anywhere between 0.05 to 1 em as letter spacing on any of these kind of eyebrow headlines. And again, we're going to use em here because it's going to scale proportionally to the size of text. If you glance back and forth at these two different versions, I think what starts to happen is you realize that the original version, which had no letter spacing in it, starts to look cramped, almost as if you put a negative amount of letter spacing in it. When you see these two side by side, you can really tell what kind of difference this makes. This happens because all capital letters actually take up the same amount of height. And when that happens, it makes it harder to read. Adding this letter spacing in there gives those letters a little bit more room to breathe and makes it easier for your eye to follow along. Now, it is important to mention that this doesn't scale well to very large text, so if you were to apply this to something like a giant headline, you probably wouldn't want to add this kind of extra letter spacing. It's going to make it too hard to read. But anytime you have small, like body size copy, I think this rule actually works really well. As kind of a side note, make sure that anytime you're using all uppercase letters like this, you're typing it in a normal sentence case and then using CSS to text transform those letters all to uppercase. If you type everything in all caps, some screen readers will actually read them out letter by letter as if they're an abbreviation. Now, a lot of those are better about that these days, but you can still run into issues if you ever wanted to transform that text in a different layout, then you would have to retype that text anyways. So it's always better to go ahead and type it out in a natural sentence case and then use CSS to transform that text to all uppercase. Using pure black like the hex code 000 or pure white like the hex code FFF actually creates an extreme amount of contrast that can be really fatiguing for your eyes. Not only that, you kind of box yourself into a situation where if you ever wanted to use a shadow on your black background, you simply couldn't do it because there's nothing darker than pure black. Same goes for any kind of highlights. If you're using white, then you can never do anything brighter than that on top of it. So you've kind of set a limitation for yourself. Because of this, I really like to use an almost black as my black color and an almost white as my white color. Sure, if you put this next to a pure black and a pure white, you're going to be able to tell the difference. But in context to your website, that's not going to be the case, and everybody's going to see this as black and white anyways. If you really want to take your neutrals to the next level, then consider tinting them with just a little bit of cool or warm colors. If you use a cool color, you can make your designs a little bit more sleek and modern. If you use a warm color, it can be a little bit more inviting. I usually make my decision based off the brand colors. So if the brand has blues in it, I might go cooler. If the brand had reds in it, then I might go with a warmer shade. Now you don't want to overdo this, of course, because you do want these to still play as black and white, but by adding just a little hint of color to them, you can actually make the brand feel more cohesive. One of the most important aspects of design is creating visual hierarchy. Now that sounds fancy, but all it really means is we need to make some things look more important than other things. In some ways, you already do this by just giving things different background colors. But one way to use this to really create intentional visual hierarchy is to start thinking about things 3D. And I don't mean we have to give things actual shape, but just by layering things on top of each other. Some things are going to be closer to the viewer while some things are further away. We use the term background for a reason. We know that that's in the back of the website. Things like cards might sit on top of the background, which actually makes them closer to the visitor. You can actually use color to influence the way things feel layered on top of each other. In this first example here, we have a background with 3 cards on top of it. In this case, the background of the website is lighter than the background of the cards. But the way light usually works is the lighter colored things appear closer to us or like they're on top. Now, I wouldn't say that this design looks bad, but I think if you see it in comparison with this other one, where the background is darker than the cards, then it's a whole lot easier to see in the second version that the cards are on top of the background. Just by making the cards a lighter color than the background, we gave the illusion that they're sitting on top of the background. This same principle actually works in both light mode and dark mode, where you want the lighter color to be on top of the darker color. Now, it's really easy to get carried away with something like this and think that every element on your page needs to be on top or behind another, but I would caution you to go too far with this tip. Really what you want to think of is your website in just a few layers of surfaces. Usually there's the background. Sometimes you have things sitting directly on top of the background. Other times you have something kind of on an elevated surface, like these cards, for example, that are above the background. Really, I wouldn't get any further than maybe 2 to 4 different surface levels, and within each one of those surfaces, you don't really have to follow these rules. When it comes to typography, using too many different font weights can really make your design look cluttered. You might think that having all that variety makes things more interesting, but different font weights carry meaning, even if it is subconscious, and by having too many different variations on the page, you can actually confuse your visitors. If you look at this example, you'll see we're using 400 for our body copy, which is pretty typical, but we're using a 300 weight for our light text and 500 for our bold text. Because these 3 weights are so close to one another, it can make it really hard to differentiate between them. Sure, you can tell the difference here when they're side by side, but what about this one? A much more effective approach is to skip font weights. So let's say you still wanted to use 400 as your base normal font weight. Instead of using 300 for your light, skip 300 and go down to 200 for your light. And instead of using 500 for your bold, skip 500 and go up to 600 for your bold. By doing this, you help differentiate the different font weights and create more visual hierarchy, which we already know is important. Using less font weights actually makes your website faster as well. A lot of builders, when you load in a font, will bring in every single weight of it, and when you add that to your website, whether you're using every weight or not, it's going to load that on the page every time somebody visits any page on your website. By narrowing this down to only the font weights you really need, you're going to significantly speed up your load times on your website, which is always a great bonus. So now you've learned each of these 5 tips, let's try to put them into practice. Here on the screen, you can see a dark mode type site with a pretty nice card design. I've intentionally not followed all these rules, so we can create a side-by-side version where we fix all of these things using the tips you learned in this video and see how much it improves the design. We'll start with our first lesson here, which had to do with the button padding. As you can see, this button here looks a little bit stumpy, so let's fix that. We'll change this to 1 em of top and bottom padding and 2 ems of left and right padding. By doing that, we've created a more substantial button and one that looks a little bit more solid in the design. Our second rule had to do with this eyebrow text. You can see we're using it here for the category. Let's go ahead and add 0.1 letter spacing to this and see what kind of difference it makes. Yeah, now you can see these side by side. You can tell that the one on the right is a whole lot easier to read than the one on the left. In fact, the one on the left looks like I've put negative letter spacing in it, even though it's just set to 0. We'll go ahead and combine the steps for our third and our fourth rule, which really had to do with the color here. As you can see, I've gone with a completely neutral palette in this original design, and I'd like to spice this up by introducing just a little bit of cool colors for this design. I also need to get rid of the stark pure black and the pure white. We'll sub those out for colors here in the Tailwind Zinc color palette. We'll make sure that the background is darker than the background of the card. And we'll make sure that the card background is not pure black. And we'll also add just a little bit of tint of color to the text on the card so that it's not a pure white. Lastly, since all these fonts look like they're about the same weight, in this case, all I think I need to do is make the bold headline just a little bit more bold. We'll bump this up to a 600 weight, and just like that, we've applied every one of these rules to this card design, and I think we've made a pretty significant improvement. Now, when I look at the card on the left, I don't see that there's anything terribly wrong with it. I wouldn't be offended by this design, but when you see it side by side with the one on the right definitely looks more polished. Of course, rules were meant to be broken, and I wouldn't say that I follow this in every single design I create, nor would I say that you need to follow these like they're the gospel. They're just a good starting place to make sure that your design is going in the right direction. If you find that a design looks good, but maybe something's just a little bit off, I hope that some of these 5 different tips that I shared today could be the tweaks that take you from a good design to a great design. Now, if you learned something new in this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. In fact, you could even leave me a comment with your favorite tip that you learned. If you want to make sure to catch my next video, then go ahead and hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.